Leadership isn't an individual sport anymore. This level of disruption and complexity, volatility that we're experiencing isn't for a lone individual leader to try and solve. It is for the entire executive suite. Executive leaders are overwhelmed because
Meet Dr. Jacqueline Conway, the founder and Principal Director of Waldencroft, with 30 years of experience advising CEOs and executive teams, also the host of the Advanced Executive Leadership podcast. She brings strategic insight, ethical guidance, and developmental depth to help organizations achieve their goals.
structure and design of the organization has to allow people to be able to step up, because if you try and step up but the executive team are micromanaging the functional stuff, then it's very hard for that level to step up.
On what you term executive readiness and the executive readiness gap, how CPOs see the challenges of possibilities of executive leadership in a disruptive world.
The gap was sort of threefold. So one of the things that the executive readiness gap highlighted is that
Hello, Jacqueline, and welcome to The Power Between.
Roddy, thank you for having me. It's absolutely lovely to be here. Really looking forward to this conversation today.
You're the founder and director of Waldencroft, the executive leadership consultancy, and a coach to senior leaders and senior leadership teams. You also completed a doctorate in top team groups a few years ago. So I think it's fair to say that you're steeped in both the theory and the real life practice of senior leaders in organizations. Now, of course, this podcast, The Power Between, focuses on mid-level leaders primarily. And my belief is that there are very distinct set of challenges and contexts for large layer in the middle of organizations. They clearly have authority, less cross-organizational visibility than senior leaders. And they can have great influence, but they're probably, and even more so, I think, when they're aligned together as a group. People at the top of organizations clearly have more of those. And I'm keen to explore some of those differences and also the similarities of the issues with senior leaders. And I'm sure we'll get to that. But perhaps we should start with your research report that caught my eye on what you term executive readiness and the executive readiness gap, how CPOs see the challenges of possibilities or of executive leadership in a disruptive world. I mean, it's clear that disruption and so change never stops these days, and senior leaders need to continually adapt to it and for it. But it's also the mid-level leaders who have to do the implementation, and that can be exhausting and perhaps even a bit demoralizing when the plans keep changing. I would like to talk a little bit about the report, how it came about, and your main findings.
Yeah, sure. So earlier this year, one of the things that my colleagues and I in Waldencroft noticed was the level of disruption in organizations was increasing, and how sort of punch drunk by that the executive leaders that we were observing seemed to be, because it was coming from multiple different places and it didn't seem to have let up. In fact, we noticed a shift even in the market just coming up to the UK general election last year, where people didn't know if the UK general election was going to happen in May. And since then, there's just been a series of things that have continued to happen. But of course, this is on the back of huge changes, geopolitical changes, technological changes, environmental changes against the backdrop of a climate crisis and all sorts of other interesting things going on. So we noticed that leaders were having to grapple with this disruption that seemed not anymore to be sort of sporadic, but rather to be ingrained now in the way that they have to lead. And that we were seeing one of the impacts of that was a sense of overwhelm by very senior leaders. And so it raised a curiosity, how ready are executive leaders to live within this environment, this highly volatile, uncertain, disruptive environment that they now find themselves leading within, as the sort of undercurrent of everything that they're doing. And that then led me to conduct the research, the executive readiness gap. And I conducted that research with chief people officers, so those people who are the senior HR people who have a seat in the C-suite. And I was particularly interested in that group because they've got a doubly unique perspective. They are both in the executive team, so they are with their colleagues grappling with this level of disruption as a member of that team. But because of their responsibilities for developing the capacities and capabilities of leaders in the organisation, including that team, they also had to step outside of their role within the team and say, how ready is this team to lead in this particular context? And so that's why the research focused on them. And I spoke with 40 chief people officers across the UK and internationally, who are in executive teams with fairly large and complex organisations with grappling with these sorts of complexities. And really what we found was that there was a gap in the executive readiness, and that the gap was sort of threefold. One, there was a kind of cognitive gap, that executive leaders were overwhelmed, and in actual fact, they didn't necessarily have some of the capacities to deal with disruption, and we can come on and talk about what those capacities are. There was also something about the relational readiness. So what was it like to actually be in a team where you needed to lean into not knowing, and what's actually required in a team dynamic to be okay with not knowing and to stay with the not knowing long enough so that you could find real solutions rather than just go to the kind of typical off-the-shelf solutions that kind of might make you feel better but don't actually resolve the issue. And then there was a developmental readiness. Executive chief people officers and executive leaders were sort of saying, we know that we need development, but we don't know what that looks like anymore. We've done the sort of take us out of the context and do sometimes very expensive leadership development with us, but actually it's not cutting it anymore and we need something different. So they needed development, but they're not getting the development and they don't actually know how to tap into it. So that was the research. We found it absolutely fascinating. And indeed, the people that we have then fed that back to in industry have also found it fascinating.
The issue is pervasive, isn't it? And the whole concept of ambiguity and having to make decisions and strategy in a world of not just partial knowledge, but also one that is constantly changing. So even if you think you know what you know, by the time you get to implement it, the context changed, is really stressful, I think. So, and I love those two parts. I mean, the cognitive part dealing around that. But tell us a bit more about the developmental side, because I mean, you say that some of the development is available, can be really expensive, but not necessarily hugely impactful. Do you have a sort of an ideal that people should be? I mean, I suspect it's the usual thing that there is no silver bullet. There's no one way to resolve this. But what do you see as some of the best practices?
Let's think about how we have developed leaders before they get to the C-suite. So leaders typically are developed, well, they're promoted and they move up and through the organisation, typically on their technical and functional skills. So by the time leaders have got to the C-suite, we can, we call a deliberate assumption, even though we might be wrong, in Waldencroft, that by the time senior leaders get to the C-suite, they are excellent in their functional and technical area, and that they have had development. Perhaps primarily their development has focused on that technical or functional area. So they have continued professional development and other development that's to do with their area of specialisation. And then as they start to do leadership development, there's a unique thing that happens where typically we take leaders or managers out of their context and we take them away to a nice hotel for a few days and we do all sorts of exercises. When I say we, in Waldencroft, that is not we don't do that, but that the development community of which I am a part, that is traditionally the way that we've done things. And the assumption has been that people then can take what they have learned back into that organisational context and apply that. And in some cases they can. It's not that all leadership development is broken and none of it works. Some of it is excellent. And and really does work. And we talk to leaders very often who still years later talk about the profound impact of leadership development that they've had. But once they get to the C-suite, we think that there are two kind of quite unique things that happen. One is that those leaders typically, not universally, but typically think that they're kind of done. They've got to the C-suite, they've arrived, they're obviously here because, they've got these great capacities and capabilities, and there's a sort of sense of, the microwave has pinged on my development, I'm cooked, I'm done, I don't need any more. So actually convincing very senior leaders who have maybe picked up a bit of ego on the way, that actually they need to do development is actually a harder sell, as it were, than it is for people who are still kind of very thirsty for it. And then what happens at the C-suite is that the development that people have had previously in their career has largely also been individual development. It's about them developing their own capacities and capabilities. But we believe that when you get to the C-suite, what's absolutely essential is this idea of what we call collective enterprise leadership. So leadership isn't an individual sport anymore. It's something that's done with your executive colleagues, because what we're seeing and what the research highlighted is that this level of disruption and complexity and volatility that we're experiencing in our world right now isn't for a lone individual leader to try and solve. It is for the entire executive suite and the much wider leadership community to find answers to together. So leadership development hasn't ever really factored in this kind of collective piece, the fact that it has to happen collectively. And as I said, we take people traditionally out of their context and then we put them back in with a sort of fingers crossed hope that they'll be able to apply it to context. So what does that say? It says that leadership development then needs to be collective, it needs to be in context, and it needs to be something that executive leaders feel that is of benefit to them at the level that they're at. And so I believe that that leadership has to be in situ. You have to do the development of the leaders live as they are grappling with organizational challenges. That is the vanguard, the cutting edge of leadership development. And it requires very different sorts of people to develop them, because they have to be able to immerse themselves in their clients' problems and only deploy the sorts of models, tools, approaches, thinking, mindset as they observe the team getting off track from what they're actually required to do. So that's why that it's not common, but we believe that it's absolutely essential.
It seems to me that what you're describing there is coaching, really, to a large extent, whether it's team coaching or individual coaching, but it's people who are in the process, are there with them, at the moment, and it's over an extended period of time. I mean, I've been around the block reporting and publishing articles and writing articles around executive education for too long, perhaps. And it always surprises me that there's still such a heavy emphasis on taking people away for the immersion, whether that's 5 days or maybe 3 days over every month for 4 or 5 months or whatever. And then it stops. This is a continuous journey. And a lot of it may not be rocket science. It's something that we understand. We just need to keep being reminded of. So it needs to be being raised up and keep practicing. It's a bit like exercise or diet or something. You can't just do it once and then expect it to keep being good. You've got to keep training those muscles, basically. This focus you have on collective enterprise leadership is vital. Do you think that should start lower down in the organization? Should people start thinking about their collaborative abilities earlier on?
Yeah, I've got quite a lot to say about that. And if I can circle back to that, but just come to your coaching point, because I believe that team coaching is an essential component of that development, and I don't think it's the only thing. So team coaching, for that longer term piece where you're embedded in the team, observing them, doing their work, and perhaps doing some process consultation with them and helping them pause and think about how they're having the conversation or how they're grappling with the problem is, I think, is an essential tool now for very senior teams. And I think that it's unfair for us to expect the chief executive to both chair the meeting and be a participant in the meeting and hold a kind of process role. And, it's just, it becomes too messy. So somebody who sits outside of that, I think, is essential. But I do think that there is a different development that, in addition to coaching, is needed, where it is more episodic rather than the ongoing piece, and it does grapple with a particular challenge that the team is facing. So if I could just give you a couple of examples of that, of what that might look like. So one of the things that the executive readiness gap highlighted is that executive leaders are overwhelmed by the disruption because they're reacting to it. Because in effect, it is happening to them. And because that thing happening to them is coming from multiple places simultaneously, it has this sort of whack-a-mole sort of feeling to it all, where they're just never quite done. And then what happens is that the stress system is activated, and we are living then in a constant state of anxiety, waiting for the next thing to arrive. Now, what's missing, therefore, is the process of anticipatory leadership, leaders being able to anticipate some of these things so that they're not just reacting to them when they arrive, but they are also being able to see those things come, and then they're able to be more planful and less reactive when they do come. Now, of course, there are some things that when they happen, we haven't been able to anticipate them. So the moment that COVID arrived, none of us could have anticipated that that was going to arrive in that moment. Now, futurists knew that a global pandemic was an absolute certainty, but they didn't know, was it going to be a coronavirus? Was it going to be a flu virus? Was it going to be something else? Where was it going to, so they couldn't have anticipated all of that. So there are still some things that will arrive that we have to deal with on a reactive basis. But if we haven't done any anticipatory work, if we haven't been able to say, what are the critical uncertainties in this business that we could look to the weak signals in the environment, do good, what we call futures and foresight work, to be able to say, how might that issue there, renewable energy and the transition to renewable energy, coalesce with this other thing here, which is that we have a lack of growth, and therefore there are political murmurings about, other things around the just transition. And how might those two things coalesce to create scenarios that any one of them, so that's why we call it futures with an S plural rather than future, because there are any number of possible, preferable,
Yeah, roots to
plausible,
that.
futures that could come to pass. But if you have scenario planned those futures, then as an executive team, you have increased your preparedness for a possible future that you don't yet know. You've been able to rehearse that future before it arrives. So before the whack-a-mole, before your threat system is activated, you're able to tap into your prefrontal cortex and be able to use your executive function literally and metaphorically in those cases. And you are training yourselves as an executive team to work with uncertainty and not knowing, without that being bad or wrong. Some of the executive teams I work with say things like, you could never not know in this team. You have to always act like you know what's coming. So there are things like doing futures and foresight work, helping teams understand the difference between complicated environments and complex environments, helping teams develop moral awareness. Many of the teams I go into are grappling with big ethical challenges, and they don't actually know that they're grappling with an ethical challenge. So if you do some work with them, with things that they're dealing with, and help them see the kind of ethical aspect of the conundrum and help embed a model of moral awareness in that team, then you're still doing more traditional development work, but you're not taking them out of the context. Of course, you can still take them to a nice fancy hotel. That's not what we mean by taking them out of the context. The context is that rather than inviting them to deal with case studies of an environment that's alien to them, that you're inviting them to grapple with and potentially solve organizational problems that they already have. So, and those two things, coaching and that kind of in situ development, I think are really complementary. So that's my answer to your, is it coaching?
Yeah.
Is
Yep.
that it is coaching and it's something else.
Coaching and, yep.
And then to your piece around, well, enterprise leadership, should we be doing it further down? I believe it's incumbent on everyone in the organization to be thinking about, what's going on, and the layer of leaders and managers that you're particularly interested in, Roddy, have got this unique perspective in the organization because they are sufficiently close to the front line, what's going on, that they are able to spot things changing in the environment very often before those people sitting in the C-suite. So if you don't have the lines of communication and the dialogue open in an organization where senior leaders who are trying to build this anticipatory capacity are cutting themselves off from one of the sources of the wisdom of that, then I think that that's an organizational danger and it's a risk. So yes, we should be inviting everyone in the organization to be thinking about that. But I do believe that the role of the managerial level is different from the level of executive leaders, and executive leaders shouldn't be putting the responsibility of enterprise leadership all across the organization. I think that when enterprise leadership stands for everything, it stands for nothing. One of the things we see in Waldencroft is that as a leader moves up and through the organization, there are 4 fundamental shifts in their leadership perspective that has to change. And we can come on and talk about what they might be in the middle layer in a moment, if that's of use. But when they make the pivot from the very senior sort of leading the function to moving into the C-suite, what we need leaders to stop doing, in effect, is focusing primarily on the in and down in the organization and shift that towards including up and out, and a focus from the kind of functional leadership in the here and now to a there and then, and one in the functional leadership that's much more focused on day-to-day execution and delivery and excelling in that, to one that's much more about how do we help this organization adapt in our new world. So that's enterprise leadership as far as we're concerned. Different academics and different consultancies have slightly different models, but we believe that sits at the very senior levels, and it's much more about up and out and there and then, helping the organization adapt. Now, but as I said, each layer of the organization, so that's what we would call requisite leadership for that level. And where we got that term requisite leadership from is from a social psychologist called Elliot Jaques. He did lots of really interesting stuff. And he said each layer or each strata in the organization has a profoundly different role to play in the organization. And if we're not clear about those roles and we don't give people all of the authority and responsibility that's appropriate for that, then we don't have an organization that's requisite, that the appropriate thing is happening at the appropriate level. And what happens in an organization is that as people move up and through the organization, that these 4 fundamentals of leadership growth that I talked about, there are 4 shifts that typically happen. One is that the time horizon that people work to is different. So let me give you an example of what that might look like at the middle level, but also at the junior level. So just before we hit record today, we were talking about our now growing up children, and my son Marcus, when he was at university, one of his first jobs was he got a role over Christmas stacking shelves in a supermarket over the Christmas period. And his role was early in the morning to stack these shelves And so he would arrive at 6:45 in the morning, and he would be given the cages of milk from the chill, and he would wheel it to the fridges, and he would kind of 2 by 2 load up, take 20 minutes or whatever, go back. Oh, there's the yogurts, or here's the pressed juices or whatever. So the time horizon for that job was like in 20-minute increments of like how long it took him to get this cage from the chill and put it into the fridges, and then his supervisor told her what was next.
The classic time and motion study type.
Classic time and motion. So at the very junior levels, the time horizon that a leader has to grapple with, it goes from minutes and hours and days. But then if you think about that supermarket supervisor, they're thinking about on shift, did the delivery come in time? Did we get the product out in time? The store manager is thinking about what's happening with the two big programs of work that we've got between now and, we're recording this in September, between now and Christmas. So, we've got a big campaign for Halloween, and, there's a Halloween campaign. And then we've got the bigger, longer campaign up to the big, really big retail peak at Christmas time in the UK. And we've got a week-to-week thing. So people are starting to think much longer ahead. And then if you think about the C-suite of that supermarket, they're thinking about the time horizon is, what are the changing demographics in the UK? What's their changing eating habits? What's actually changing in the things that we want to consume? Therefore, how do we need to shift our supply chains to have more of this kind of food and less of that kind of food? So we can see right from market stacking shelves all the way up the organisation. For good requisite organisation, for the middle managers,
mid-level leaders.
It's like, what organisations need to be clear, what is the requisite time horizon that they're expecting your leaders to grapple with? It's an important role because, you and I have talked in the past that one of the things that happens is that as organisations meet financial challenges and they need to make redundancies, often, that swathe of people in the middle go. And very often it goes because they've not been absolutely clear about what's really required at that level and what vital function those people are, those vital function that those people are playing.
It's presumably very contextual, those time horizons, and it varies. But in fact, I was just trying to run through a number of different sort of industries, sectors in my head, and it's probably doesn't vary enormously, actually. I mean, so you've just given us an example, supermarkets and sort of food distribution. We're probably looking at at the shortest in weeks and up to months for people in the middle of the organization, the store manager type of person. If we're looking at professional services, they're probably looking around the same kind of thing too. I don't know, and extractive industries, probably the same kind of thing, manufacturing. It probably doesn't vary wildly, does it? I mean,
I think that it does depend a little bit on how many strata you have in the organisation, how many levels you have, what's the nature of, what's your kind of turnaround cycle time, what's the nature of the work that you're doing. So Elliot Jacques, whose work that we lean on here, I think was too prescriptive. He sort of said, oh, there are this many layers and it always looks like this. And I don't think that stands to scrutiny now in 2025. But yeah, I mean, there's only so many possibilities and ranges of possibilities there, aren't there? And so the same then is true for the other three things that happen as people move up and through the organisation. The second is that the relationship to the task becomes more distant. So if we continue with our supermarket, if the primary task of that organisation is to sell products in a retail environment to consumers, groceries and other things, and that's the primary task, then the Marcuses of the world stacking the shelves are really close to that, because you can't buy your milk unless the distribution has worked and there's been a boy working, getting the stuff onto the shelf. So but the relationship to that task becomes more abstract for your supervisors and for your store managers, and more abstract again when you get to head office and then kind of to C-suite. So we see that relationship to task becoming more distant as people become more senior. And therefore, one of the things that happens is that the complexity increases. One of the things that Marcus said to me about that job, and it wasn't to criticise it, actually they were very good to him, and there was lots that was positive about that job that he only did for sort of 3 or 4 months that helped him as a student get through that kind of Christmas period and earn some money. But he described it as deathly dull. So there was no complexity in it. There was no sense that he could bring any of his creative flair or anything to the job. It was just like, get the cages of the
He'd
milk
pretty
and
much mastered it by the end of day one.
day one, and then it was just like, he was like, can I put my headphones in and just kind of do this to get through the hours? Whereas the complexity increases the more, and the more senior you get, so you're grappling with, this run up to, your busiest season of the year as a store manager. There's many, many, many other things that you're having to grapple with. The other thing that we would say, Elliot Jacques didn't say this, but it feels self-evident to me as I've been doing this work over the years, is that the ethical implications of your work become much greater. So your ethical implications of the work of having global supply chains at the C-suite level is of an order of magnitude far greater than anything that the people in the store could be grappling with. And therefore, these are the things that are enterprise leadership kind of responsibilities. But I think that in every good organisation, they should know what is requisite or appropriate for their middle managers, and they should be really clear about that. Now, as we've already alluded to, that doesn't mean that we're expecting those middle managers to not talk up the way and down the way. We want that to happen. But, we should be, I think it's been a failure in good organisation design over the years. I mean, I think it is a symptom of bad organisation design that when an organisation finds itself in a lean period, that it lets that middle layer go, because it means that they haven't been thoughtful or deliberate about what that layer is for and what really those people add in the organisation, which I kind of, as you see, is absolutely vital. So I think I've said quite a lot there. I'll let you come in and just
I've got 3 there. There was a 4th one. I've got time horizons, complexity, and the ethical implications.
And the relationship so time horizon increases, relationship to task becomes more distant. So less doing, more leading. Then there's the piece about complexity. Then there's the piece about ethics.
In terms of developing those capacities, how should we see? I mean, the time horizon one, I think, probably stretches as the role stretches. The ethical one's interesting because you don't have much influence. You've got no influence, basically, on the ethics of the organization at the front line. And even when you get into the middle of the organization, the strategy is the structure that you play within.
Yeah.
And so that's really a whole new set of sort of awareness and decisions when you get up there. But as you say, there needs to be a conversation, a communication. So we're perhaps expecting people, and people will be inevitably thinking about the ethical implications of what they're doing in the middle of organizations, but they're limited in how they can shape it. So are there sort of obvious opportunities where people can express feelings around that, or does it just have to be done informally, do you think?
So I absolutely take your point that the ethical peril is greater the more senior you get, and therefore the adherence to not just kind of compliance and law, but the organization's deep values and ethical stance on things has to be driven at the top, but it also has to be implemented further down. So what we know, for example, about the financial crash was that the boards and C-suites of so many of the big financial institutions that caused the crash had absolutely no idea that these complex financial instruments that were being put in place at the kind of middle level in the organizations they didn't know about them, and they were too complex. So there is a really good question about whose responsibility is that. If you're packaging up these kind of bad debts from different places and selling it on subprime debt to different places, which is actually what was happening at the mid-level, then these are ethical questions. Now, how does an organisation like Credit Suisse or those organisations that later said, we had no idea at the board level and at the C-suite level what was actually happening. And it wasn't unique to them. It was, many, many financial institutions, all of them who were impacted by it, were doing the same thing. It does raise a question about how do we have conversations in organizations that helps people, particularly in where they are knowledge workers and they do have the capacity then to do things where they don't see perhaps the second and third and fourth order implications of the work. Because I'm sure that none of those people got up in the morning and thought, I'm going to package these different kind of bits of subprime debt and I'm going to sell it on to another financial services institution and thus create the biggest global recession that we've
Not
seen
at all.
since
But
the
I mean, the interesting thing
1920s.
about that, of course, was that, yeah, I mean, it was because they were very siloed up, wasn't it? And
Uh-huh.
and financial algorithm or complexity of these products was so enormous that no one but the person who was sort of coding it at the front end really understood it. And the person who was coding it at the front end, the supposition was so immersed in the sort of beauty, perhaps, of the mathematics of it that they weren't actually thinking of it in the real world at all. So that they were sort of isolated from it. And it needs those people who can tie all those parts together. And I suspect a lot of that falls on people in this sort of senior mid-level, who are close to the geeks who are writing those things, which no one else can really understand.
So that organization, those financial organizations were not requisite because they had given too much complexity of what they were working with was greater than the organizational capacity to actually make sense of
Understand it.
it.
Yeah.
But the implications of it were absolutely massive. Now that's where you've got real people who and actually there were whistleblowers and there were people who tried to sort of raise their hands. So there's all sorts of implications, aren't there, for organizations around how do we really listen to the middle management layer, because they are the people who can spot these things. But that's when you can spot it. Think about AI. We've already said that AI is a black box. We don't know. What we mean by a black box is that we don't know how it comes up with the thinking that it comes up with, because we input the algorithmic kind of the coding that happens and it continues to code itself. It gets to a point where as human beings, we've got no idea how that happens. So if if the financial crash happened with human beings doing the coding, what are the potential implications in organizations where we're not even doing it anymore? I mean, it's sort of mind-boggling, really.
But I mean, this is very much at the core of exploring mid-level leadership, because what we frequently say, and I strongly believe, is that we see a lack of engagement throughout organizations, and the primary way to increase engagement is to give people more responsibility and feel that they're doing more meaningful work, and they can see the objective of what they're doing is, and why what they're doing is important to reaching that objective, but also giving them an element of agency and choice in doing that. And I think that's a priority to be able to offer that. But we're also saying that if we're devolving that responsibility too much and we don't understand it, and the leaders don't understand what's being done, then chaos ensues. So it's a fine balance, really, between that. And I suspect what often happens is we err on the side of not giving agency, not devolving, because it's safer to keep control yourself than loosen your grip on the reins.
I agree with that. So there is a conundrum there, isn't there? It's so that's what we mean by the word requisite. Requisite means
Yeah,
at the right.
the sort of appropriate
Yeah,
amount.
yeah, yeah. So what is requisite in one organization? Well, if you're an airport, then the requisite responsibility will be different for your middle managers who, really you should be giving as much authority to them to make decisions on shift that you can possibly do versus, complex financial derivatives, that could have massive global implications. Not so much. But to your point about do we give them enough? Do we empower middle levels more or less? I think one of the things that we see in organizations that I work with at senior level is there are two really main reasons why executive leaders hold on to too much of their functional responsibility. So they're all still wearing a functional hat by the time that they get to the C-suite. They're still, if you're a chief people officer, you're leading the people in HR and culture remit. If you're the chief financial officer, you're leading the finance. So you're
Still
still
signing off the accounts.
yeah. So you still have your functional responsibility, but the pivot that's required as you move into the C-suite towards this collective enterprise leadership is that you shift your gaze up, and that your relationship to the finance and to the HR things or the operational things is overseeing rather than doing. Now, what we experience in many executive teams as the norm is that there's two, and we found in the research that there was too much of a swing towards the kind of functional place for these C-suite leaders. Now, one reason that we often hear is, well, I just need to get that next layer in place. I just need to get these people really humming along brilliantly before I can lift my gaze upwards. And in some cases that might be true, but that is a time-limited excuse, frankly. And very often it is coupled with a genuine reticence, fear perhaps, at the C-suite level of making that transition because, as I say, complexity increases. What we mean by that is you move from a world in which the development of the annual report or the quarterly analysts meeting or whatever are fairly chunky kind of bits of work that you can excel in and do very, very well. Whereas when you start to get into the real kind of complexity of like, how might this thing impact us in 5 years' time? You're in the place of not knowing. Well, a lot of leaders who've been promoted up and through the organization on the basis of their technical specialism, we're asking them to divest themselves a bit of that and move into that. But if they don't, then they become the block. They are effectively working at a pay grade below what they're actually being paid. But we have seen in organizations where they step up, they create the capacity, everything steps up, everything, because the functional heads, your director or head of, needs to then fully occupy their functional responsibility. Each strata, then there's an opportunity for them to step into it. And so we see in organizations that when the C-suite really move into collective enterprise leadership, that the rest of the organization you see a flourishing because people are able to step into the capacities that they have that perhaps have been lying dormant because there's been a stultifying effect when the executives are too focused in and down.
I mean, I think that's critical, isn't it? That understanding that transition, and for the individuals concerned, understanding they have to let go and allow other people to fill that space. But I mean, as you said, the problem is that they feel very comfortable filling that space because it's something that they know they're competent and capable to do, whereas there is more ambiguity at the next level up and complexity, and that's a more difficult space to hold. So from your perspective and role, how do you nudge people to do that?
What we're dealing with is kind of quite overwhelmed executive teams. So it's helping them to see that it's not any better not dealing with the reality, which is that they have to move into grappling with the disruption, that it's not a lone sport, as it were, that the reason we call it collective enterprise leadership is because they do it together. And in really good teams where they are able to grapple with these level of disruption well, it's a very cohesive team. There's a lot of psychological safety in that. So sometimes you have to start with those places of helping them bit by bit let go of the functional, by helping them step into the enterprise, by doing that sort of anticipatory leadership, by helping them to grapple with these other problems in a way and that's why a good coach or a good developmentalist that works alongside the team actually acts as a container for their anxiety as well, that helps them titrate the work, do a little bit more like this and a little bit more like this, but before you know it, the team are really operating at a level that's kind of qualitatively significantly different from the kind of functional lead space. And some people step into it easier than others. It's a bit of a luck of the draw because almost all of them have been promoted on their technical capability. So what we're not doing from a succession point of view is promoting people on their capacity to be able to live in the uncertainty.
Yeah, exactly. Anything that the next layer, the people who are filling those empty shoes can do to own the space a little bit more, do you think? I mean, it's much more difficult, obviously, to tell your boss that they're micromanaging you or they're doing your job for you.
So we're always aware of talent, aren't we? We're always aware of individual talent, and organisations tend to make allowances for really good talent. But that's a kind of old idea about, the lone kind of brilliant person. And if you wanted to deal with it structurally across the piece, we, many years ago, did a piece of work where the executive team said, no, we don't really want you to work with us yet. You can get to us, but we want you to work with the next level down. They're not stepping up enough. And so we did this really good piece of work with really able and willing and enthusiastic senior leaders who wanted to kind of really step up. And what we found is that they were hitting their head against a glass ceiling. So in some ways, the structure and design of the organisation has to allow people to be able to step up. Because if you try and step up, but the executive team are in and around all of your, they're micromanaging the functional stuff, then it's very hard for that level to step up. And if they're not stepped up, they're doing
Yeah,
more in and
cascades
down, and it
down.
kind of goes down the entire organisation. So that's why I believe that you start with the senior team. That was why I got into the work that I got into, because I was doing large scale complex change in many organizations. And actually, they were blaming, all sorts of other people for it not happening. And invariably my view was, well, it's actually the C-suite and the very senior levels that are not adopting what they should be adopting, and that's why it's not happening further down. So that's why we in Waldencroft work with that senior level first and then go to the next level, and then we don't then work below that level, but other organizations
Right.
can come in and help to develop the capacities of those more middle managers who really have got more capacities than many organizations are letting them.
I think that's the key point is that, I mean, we see organizations going through so many layers of interviewing and different challenges and tests in the recruitment process. And so they've got to be pretty confident that they're getting good people. And then they don't give them often don't give them the space to use those capacities when they get in there. But it seems to be a chronic challenge. It goes on, and I suppose it was that phrase that you just used, that sort of psychological safety is absolutely key to it. People need to feel they've got the confidence and the space to allow others to take on additional responsibilities.
Yes. And even within an organization, you can see pockets of psychological safety where people are able to flourish more because they've got a leader or manager who really encourages that, and other parts in the organization where that doesn't happen quite as well. So it doesn't just happen across the piece in organizations. We can see the difference that good leaders make and good managers make. And in fact, that's also what, we would expect from those people that we're talking about.
Jacqueline, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much indeed. And we are, as ever, swiftly out of time. The clock always seems to race ahead when we're having these calls. Jacqueline Conway, thank you very much indeed.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, Roddy. Appreciate it.